The palace smelled of sickness. Courtiers whispered that their queen had not left her chambers in days, yet no one dared speak the truth aloud. Behind the gilded doors of Richmond Palace, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the woman who had ruled England with unshakable will for 45 years, was rotting from within. Her death was officially described as peaceful, a gentle passing befitting England's golden monarch. But that, my friends, was a lie. A cover-up crafted by terrified advisors who feared that the truth would destroy the very image of Gloriana herself. Because the reality of Elizabeth's final days was anything but peaceful. The Queen's body was being consumed by a mysterious illness so grotesque, so horrifying, that it was buried under layers of secrecy for centuries. And only now, thanks to unearthed physician notes, personal letters, and forensic reanalysis, can we finally piece together what really happened behind those locked palace doors. You see, while historians long painted Elizabeth as dying with dignity, modern medical evidence suggests her final days were marked by unbearable suffering. Imagine a monarch once celebrated for her beauty and charisma, now plagued with swelling, lesions, and a stench so foul courtiers could barely endure her presence. The Virgin Queen, who defied popes and kings, met an end so gruesome that even her closest ladies-in-waiting begged to be dismissed from her service. And here's the kicker. The medical truth behind Elizabeth's death isn't just shocking. It completely rewrites how we understand the final chapter of the Tudor dynasty. Because her illness wasn't random, it was the result of a condition her physicians recognized but dared not name publicly. One that ravaged her from the inside out until England's greatest queen became a walking corpse. To understand the horror of Elizabeth's decline, we need to rewind to the final year of her reign, 1602. Reports from ambassadors and courtiers describe a monarch who had once been vigorous, witty, and magnetic, now wasting away in plain sight. Her appetite vanished. Her once rosy complexion, celebrated in portraits, turned a ghastly yellow-gray. More disturbingly, Elizabeth developed open sores on her skin that refused to heal, leaking fluid and reeking of infection. These were not the signs of graceful aging, they were symptoms of something far darker. The Queen grew restless, pacing the palace halls late into the night. Servants whispered that she sat motionless for hours on the cold floors, refusing to be moved, her skeletal frame shivering under heavy robes. When her counselors begged her to take to her bed, Elizabeth famously snapped, "Must is not a word to use to princes." But beneath that defiance was terror. She knew her body was failing, and she would not allow her subjects, or her enemies abroad, to see her weakness. Medical historians now believe Elizabeth suffered from a form of blood poisoning, possibly linked to the very cosmetics that had defined her iconic image. For decades, she had layered her face with Venetian ceruse, a deadly mixture of white lead and vinegar. The paint gave her that porcelain mask-like beauty immortalized in paintings, but it was slowly killing her. Lead seeps into the body, damaging organs, eroding the nervous system, and weakening immunity. By her late 60s, Elizabeth's reliance on these toxic cosmetics may have tipped her into systemic poisoning. And here's where the story turns grisly. The sores, the wasting flesh, the swelling, they all align with chronic lead toxicity, which means the Virgin Queen, who built an empire on image and perception, was destroyed by the very mask she used to project power. By the winter of 1602, the Queen's court had become a place of dread. Every day brought new rumors about Elizabeth's health, but her closest advisors, led by Robert Cecil, worked tirelessly to suppress the truth. Why? Because England's enemies were watching. Spain, still licking its wounds from the failed Armada, waited like a vulture for weakness. If news spread that the Queen was dying, it could trigger rebellion at home and invasion from abroad. So the Privy Council lied. They told foreign ambassadors that Elizabeth was merely suffering from fatigue, that she was still attending to matters of state. In reality, she could barely stand. Eyewitness accounts paint a devastating picture. Elizabeth refused food, wasting away into little more than skin and bone. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that her once lustrous hair had fallen out in clumps, leaving her scalp raw and mottled. Most horrifying of all were the ulcers. Physicians recorded festering sores that spread across her body, particularly on her legs. The stench, one wrote, was most grievous that few could abide in her chamber long. Modern doctors who've studied these reports believe the sores weren't just caused by lead poisoning. They were aggravated by an undiagnosed bloodstream infection. In an era before antibiotics, even a minor wound could turn lethal. Elizabeth's body, weakened by decades of cosmetic poisoning, could no longer fight off disease. The infection spread, her organs faltering one by one until her body became a prison of agony. And yet, even as she rotted alive, Elizabeth clung to her crown. She refused to name a successor, terrified of what would happen the moment she admitted her reign was ending. The Virgin Queen's iron will remained unbroken, but her body was collapsing in ways that horrified even those who had endured the bloody reigns of her predecessors. In March of 1603, the situation spiraled into nightmare. Elizabeth's chamber became a chamber of horrors. Servants kept the windows thrown wide despite the bitter cold, desperate to disperse the stench of rotting flesh. Visitors described the once magnificent queen as barely recognizable. Her teeth blackened, her lips cracked and bleeding, her skin mottled with purple lesions. She refused mirrors, but she could not escape the whispers that echoed even among her most loyal ladies. The Virgin Queen had become a living corpse. Physicians tried every remedy known to Elizabethan medicine, bleeding her with leeches, applying poultices of herbs, even burning sulfur in the room to purify the air. Nothing worked. In fact, the treatments only worsened her decline. The sores grew deeper, some revealing raw tissue beneath. The queen screamed when they were touched, so her ladies learned to change her linens in silence, dabbing at the discharge with trembling hands. And yet, Elizabeth refused to admit defeat. She would not lie in bed, insisting instead on sitting upright on cushions on the floor propped against the wall. For days, she barely spoke, staring into the shadows with hollow eyes. Some whispered that she saw ghosts, the specters of those she had condemned during her reign. The Earl of Essex, executed just 2 years earlier, was said to haunt her restless nights. By this point, modern physicians suggested Elizabeth's condition had entered septic shock. Her blood was poisoned, her immune system collapsing, her mind clouded by fever and toxins. But to her terrified counselors, this wasn't just the death of a monarch. It was the unraveling of England's stability. If Elizabeth died without naming an heir, civil war could erupt. Which is why, in those final days, every movement, every word, every breath of the Queen carried unbearable political weight. By late March, Elizabeth's decline could no longer be hidden. The rumors spread beyond the palace walls, carried by servants and envoys who caught glimpses of her ravaged form. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their kings that the once mighty Gloriana was now more spectre than sovereign. Within England itself, fear ran rampant. What would happen when the Queen who had defeated the Armada and presided over the golden age of Shakespeare finally breathed her last? The reality inside Richmond Palace was far worse than the whispers outside. The sores covering Elizabeth's body had multiplied, some merging into great black patches of decayed flesh. One attendant described the Queen's skin as breaking as parchment in rain. Physicians noted that her gums bled constantly, another telltale sign of lead poisoning compounded by starvation and infection. Her breath had grown unbearable, a reek of rot and pus that forced even her most loyal courtiers to cover their faces with cloths soaked in rosewater. But perhaps the most terrifying symptom was the Queen's mind. Elizabeth's legendary sharpness had dulled into confusion and delirium. Some days she spoke lucidly, asking after matters of state or scolding Cecil for pressing her to name a successor. Other days she rambled incoherently, crying out for her mother, Anne Boleyn, or whispering to the shadows as if negotiating with unseen spirits. Witnesses claimed she saw visions of children, phantoms of the heirs she had never borne. Modern forensic psychiatrists reviewing these accounts suggest that the Queen's delirium was the product of both infection and chronic heavy metal poisoning. Lead doesn't just destroy the body, it corrodes the brain, warping mood and perception. In Elizabeth's final weeks, England's greatest queen slipped between lucidity and madness, her body collapsing even as her iron will refuse to release its grip on life. The final week of Elizabeth's life was a grotesque theatre of denial. Her counsellors, terrified of the political chaos her death might unleash, continued to issue proclamations that the Queen was merely unwell. Ambassadors were assured she would soon recover. But behind the sealed doors of Richmond, the truth was ghastly. Elizabeth had grown so emaciated that her once celebrated gowns hung from her frame like shrouds. Her legs, swollen and ulcerated, leaked foul-smelling fluid that soaked through layer after layer of linen. The Queen, who had once dazzled Europe with her elaborate courtly dances, now had to be carried between cushions like a fragile relic. Her attendants reported she could barely swallow. When she attempted to drink broth, it dribbled from her mouth, staining her chin and collar with blood-tinged saliva. And yet she would not lie in bed. Superstition gripped her. Elizabeth believed that to lie down would be to admit defeat and invite death. So she crouched for hours, huddled on cushions or slumped against the wall, too weak to rise but too proud to yield. "Little man," she rasped to Robert Cecil, "the word must is not to be used to princes." Even on the threshold of death, she defied command. What makes this even more haunting is the forensic interpretation. Physicians today argue that Elizabeth was suffering from systemic sepsis combined with renal failure, her kidneys overwhelmed by toxins circulating through her bloodstream. The swelling in her legs, the ulcers, the delirium, the refusal of food, all consistent with a body shutting down organ by organ. But to her terrified counsellors, this wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a dynastic one. The last Tudor was rotting alive, and unless she named a successor, England faced the spectre of civil war. Time was running out. By March 23rd, the palace could no longer disguise the horror. Elizabeth's condition had worsened so dramatically that her ladies begged to be released from duty, unable to endure the sight or the smell of their queen's decaying body. One courtier wrote that the chamber reeked as though of the grave itself. Even the endless burning of incense and scattering of herbs across the rushes could not mask the odor of rotting flesh. Those who dared enter her chamber were struck by how much she had changed. Her face, once painted with the white mask of ceruse, had withered into a skull-like visage, the skin pulled taut over bone. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her eyes sunken, ringed with bruised purple hollows. When she spoke, her words were faint and slurred, the voice of a woman both poisoned and fevered. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence of her impending death, Elizabeth clung to her crown with the same ferocity she had shown all her life. She refused to sign documents naming James VI of Scotland as her heir. When pressed, she would fall into silence, staring with blazing eyes that seemed to dare her counsellors to defy her. Some whispered that she was haunted. Attendants reported hearing her cry out for Essex, the favourite she had condemned to death just 2 years before. Others swore she spoke to her long-dead father, Henry VIII, as though begging forgiveness for her defiance of the Catholic Church. In her fevered state, Elizabeth seemed to be conducting an invisible court of ghosts, her past rising to torment her in the last days of her life. What the counsellors feared most was that the Queen would die without speaking a word about succession. And in those final days, every hour of silence brought England closer to crisis. On March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth's vigil reached its breaking point. She had not eaten in days, her lips too dry and swollen to drink, her body collapsing under the weight of infection and exhaustion. Courtiers huddled in darkened corridors, whispering prayers and rumors alike. Some believed she was bewitched. Others murmured that God himself was punishing her for the executions and betrayals of her reign. Inside her chamber, the Queen drifted in and out of delirium. Witnesses claimed she stretched her skeletal arms toward unseen figures, whispering apologies. At one moment, she reportedly cried for her mother, Anne Boleyn, the woman executed when Elizabeth was just a child. Another time, she murmured about Mary, Queen of Scots, whom she had reluctantly ordered to the block. Whether hallucinations or confessions, her words chilled those present. Finally, after days of resistance, Elizabeth could endure no more. Too weak to sit upright, she allowed her attendants to lift her onto a pallet bed. For the first time in weeks, she lay down, a symbolic surrender that her counselors immediately understood. Death was at hand. Robert Cecil, desperate to secure the succession, pressed one last time. Would she acknowledge James VI of Scotland as heir? Eyewitnesses later recorded that Elizabeth, unable to speak, made a faint gesture, raising her hand as though pointing toward James's name. It was the closest thing to assent her counselors would ever receive, and they seized upon it as law. Modern medical experts believe that by this point, Elizabeth's body was in full systemic collapse. The poisoned cosmetics, the infection, the starvation, all converged in multi-organ failure. Her breathing grew shallow and irregular, the classic death rattle of lungs filling with fluid. Courtiers and clergy gathered around her bed, their faces pale with fear, waiting for the inevitable. As the night wore on, Elizabeth's chamber became a theater of dread. The Queen's breaths came in ragged gasps, each one rattling through her chest like the tolling of a funeral bell. Her ladies knelt by the bedside, weeping softly, while Cecil and the counselors exchanged anxious glances. Outside, the palace grounds were shrouded in silence, the entire kingdom holding its breath. What struck witnesses most was how ghastly Elizabeth looked in her final hours. Her skin had turned a waxy yellow, her veins dark and visible beneath the surface. The sores across her body had split open, oozing foul-smelling discharge that no amount of herbs or perfumes could disguise. Even the strongest among the attendants gagged, pressing cloths to their faces to endure the stench. And yet, despite the horror, there remained an undeniable aura of majesty. Elizabeth did not scream, nor did she beg for relief. Instead, she stared upward with hollow eyes, whispering fragments of prayer. One lady reported hearing her murmur, "I am tied with a chain of iron about my neck." Whether she meant the burdens of rule or the grip of death itself, no one could say. At around 2 in the morning, her breathing faltered. Witnesses described a chilling gurgle, the death rattle, as her lungs filled with fluid. Her lips moved silently, as if forming a final confession, but no sound emerged. Then, with a shudder that rippled through her frail body, Elizabeth I exhaled for the last time. The Virgin Queen was gone. The counselors stood in stunned silence, realizing the Tudor line had ended in that moment. Outside, dawn was breaking over Richmond, but within those walls, the air was heavy with the end of an era. An end far more grotesque and horrifying than official records would ever admit. The death of Elizabeth should have brought mourning, but what followed was panic. Her counselors, fearing unrest, immediately moved to control the narrative. Official proclamations described her passing as serene, in the quiet of sleep, with no struggle. But those who had witnessed the truth knew this was a fabrication. In reality, the Virgin Queen's body was already betraying her even as the news spread. Almost immediately, decomposition set in. Elizabeth's frail form, weakened by poison and disease, bloated rapidly. Her skin, stretched tight, began to darken in patches. The sores that had tormented her in life now wept into the linen shrouds, filling the chamber with an unbearable odor. Servants lit extra candles and burned barrels of incense, but nothing could mask the stench of decay. There were even darker whispers. One attendant later confided that when the body was prepared for embalming, the physicians recoiled. The corpse was already so corrupted they struggled to preserve it. The abdomen, swollen and fragile, threatened to rupture if handled roughly. The face, once painted into immortal beauty on canvas, had collapsed into a gaunt mask, the lips retracted to expose blackened teeth. And yet, just as with her reign, image triumphed over reality. Portrait painters were instructed to capture Elizabeth as timeless, serene, untouchable. Chroniclers were ordered to write of her gracious passing. None dared record the festering sores, the grotesque swelling, or the reek of corruption. For the sake of stability, England needed a saintly queen, not the truth of a rotting corpse. Modern forensic experts suggest that Elizabeth's rapid decay was accelerated by septicemia and lead toxicity, conditions that essentially pre-decomposed her body while she still lived. Her death, in other words, was not an end, but a continuation of a slow, living rot that had consumed her for months. The secrecy surrounding Elizabeth's death only deepened in the days that followed. Her body, sealed in a lead-lined coffin, was moved discreetly to Whitehall, but even the heavy casing could not completely contain what was happening inside. Servants tasked with transporting the coffin whispered that strange noises, pops, hisses, faint gurgles, echoed from within. These were the sounds of gases building as the Virgin Queen's body broke itself down from the inside. The coffin was draped in black velvet and surrounded by soldiers, yet those who passed too near described catching whiffs of an acrid, sweet stench. It was the unmistakable odor of corruption. Once again, the official story painted a picture of regal solemnity, but the reality was grotesque. Just as with Henry VIII, the Tudors' obsession with power and image demanded that the truth be hidden at all costs. When the funeral procession finally wound its way through London, the spectacle was designed to project majesty. Thousands lined the streets, weeping as they watched the coffin pass, believing their queen lay in peaceful repose. They could not know that inside the sealed container lay not Gloriana triumphant, but a decayed and leaking shell. Medical historians today point to the embalming difficulties as critical evidence. Records mention the use of excessive pitch, wax, and aromatic herbs, far more than was standard practice. This suggests that Elizabeth's corpse was already too unstable to present. In fact, some scholars believe the decision to keep the coffin sealed at all times was deliberate. Unlike monarchs before her, Elizabeth's body was never publicly displayed. There was no lying in state for her faithful subjects to see their queen one last time. Instead, the truth of her condition was hidden, ensuring that the Virgin Queen remained an untouchable icon in death, as in life. On April 28, 1603, Elizabeth's funeral reached its climax. The coffin, draped in cloth of gold, was borne through the streets of London in one of the most magnificent processions the city had ever seen. Trumpets blared, bells tolled, and tens of thousands gathered to mourn. They saw banners, effigies, and the full pageantry of Tudor statecraft. What they did not see, and what the government worked tirelessly to conceal, was the horror sealed inside that coffin. The Queen's effigy, mounted atop the casket, portrayed her as radiant and eternal, a ruler untouched by time or suffering. Yet those who had witnessed her final days knew this was a fabrication bordering on sacrilege. Beneath the velvet and flowers lay a body twisted by poison, infection, and rot. One chronicler later confided that the procession was haunted not only by grief, but by the faint, sickly sweet odor that clung to the coffin as it passed. Elizabeth was finally interred in Westminster Abbey, in a tomb that would later hold the remains of her half-sister, Mary I. The irony was striking. In life, the two queens had been bitter rivals, their religions and policies tearing England apart. In death, their bones lay side by side, united in silence. But what most mourners never realized was that Elizabeth's final resting place was also a monument to concealment. Her counselors had ensured that no public autopsy would ever be performed. The records of her physicians were sealed, many suppressed entirely. The narrative of a serene passing was carefully woven into the chronicles, while the truth, the sores, the stench, the grotesque collapse of England's most iconic monarch, was erased. It would take centuries, the rediscovery of hidden notes and forensic re-examination, to reveal the shocking medical truth. That Gloriana, England's golden queen, died not in glory, but in grotesque agony. What makes Elizabeth's death so haunting is not just the physical horror, it's the symbolism. For nearly half a century, she had been the embodiment of England itself, powerful, untouchable, immortal in the eyes of her people. She defeated the Armada, outmaneuvered kings and popes, and presided over a cultural golden age. But behind the gilded portraits and carefully curated image, her body was being betrayed by the very tools she used to maintain her majesty. Venetian ceruse, her signature cosmetic, was both her armor and her poison. It preserved the illusion of youth, even as it slowly eroded her flesh, her organs, and her mind. Modern toxicologists confirm that chronic lead exposure explains nearly every symptom. The ulcers, the hair loss, the blackened teeth, the trembling hands, even the hallucinations of her final days. Elizabeth wasn't just dying of infection. She was being consumed by the mask she wore for power. And that chilling detail reframes her entire legacy. The Virgin Queen's greatest triumph, her ability to maintain absolute control through image, was also her undoing. In death, her body became a grotesque mirror of the sacrifices she made for her throne. Her courtiers' desperate cover-up ensured that England remembered her not as the rotting corpse in Richmond, but as Gloriana, the eternal monarch. Yet the truth, now unearthed, tells a darker, more human story. Elizabeth I did not slip peacefully into the night. She fought her own body to the bitter end, pacing halls on skeletal legs, refusing the bed she believed would surrender her to death. She decayed in secret, her agony masked by incense, her image preserved by lies. And when she was finally sealed into that lead coffin, the Tudor dynasty itself was sealed with her. The golden age of England ended not with triumph, but with the stench of decay. If this hidden history shocked you, make sure you subscribe to The Tide of History. Because the story of Elizabeth's grotesque final days is just one of many truths buried beneath centuries of myth. In my next investigation, I'll uncover the scandalous secrets of Anne Boleyn's downfall. And trust me, it's not the version you learned in school. Click right here to watch it now, and I'll see you in the next deep dive into history's darkest corners.